Everyone will take your seat. We're ready to continue on. Welcome back to the podium, Commissioner Sankey, who will have a few words and maybe answer a few questions.
Yep, we have an opportunity for me not to introduce people. So Claude, thank you for that fine introduction. Staff's going to have to work on those notes. That was not a high level of detail there. I'm glad that you're all here. I've said that earlier in our visit yesterday morning. Just a couple of notes. One, we announced today that we'll extend our relationship in Greenville, South Carolina for Bon Secours Wellness Arena to host the SEC Women's Basketball Tournament. We're looking at the years 26, 27, and 28. From a basketball standpoint, just a few weeks ago, we announced the SEC serving as a host role again for NCAA basketball events here in Birmingham, and we're looking forward to hosting those in the Legacy Arena. I think a couple notes that may go unsaid unless I'm the one who says them. Fascinating similarity between our men's and women's coaches. We have 6 coaches on the men's side, 6 coaches on the women's side who have been in the Final Four with teams. You go further, all 16 of our women's coaches I know just off the top of my head have led at least one of the teams they've coached to an NCAA tournament appearance. Just an incredible depth of talent. We have 5 coaches on the men's side who've been named National Coach of the Year. Rick Barnes, Chris Beard, John Calipari, Bruce Pearl, and Rodney Terry. On the men's side, we have 65 players selected in the last 7 NBA drafts. When you go to the women's side, total of 172 former players have played in the WNBA, and I think that's a league that certainly has benefited from the platform that's created by women's college basketball. SEC teams have played on the women's side in 32 of 42 NCAA Final Fours. We've had 2 women's Final Four teams on 10 occasions, and the last 3 national champions were proudly from the Southeastern Conference. I noted it had been a while on the men's side that we've had a team in the Final Four, so Alabama returned an SEC program to the Final Four last year in Phoenix. We're hopeful, based on the preseason indications, that we'll have more of those opportunities. Beside basketball, we're in an incredible football season, halfway through, so we're through week 7 of 14 weeks. We've been busy. You obviously have seen news around the preliminary approval granted by Judge Wilkin for the proposed settlement in the House versus the NCAA matter. We are working diligently on those issues. Last Thursday, we were able to gather with our Big Ten colleagues, our athletics directors from both conferences, to talk about issues of common interest. A lot of speculation about what was talked about. The reality was we did spend the appropriate time with our counsel talking about the joint defense issues and the House settlement. We have talked about the college football playoff, really wanting to understand the expansion, the growth to 12 this year, the format decisions that will come for the 26 season and beyond. We did not spend any time talking about those format issues. That's for down the road. From our conference's standpoint, we need to experience a single division, 16-team, 8-game conference format for our football season. Then we'll go into the 12-team format. Be interesting to see how the selection committee evaluates the most deserving teams. We'll come back to those meetings as a Southeastern Conference group in January to evaluate our positioning. We did talk about scheduling, and you know what? We have a bunch of games, relatively speaking to our history, already scheduled in football with the Big Ten. We play them in crossover games in basketball regularly. I think one of the great stories last year was in Albany on Monday night. While LSU did not win the LSU-Iowa game on ESPN, compared to the national championship game the year prior on ABC, had a higher number of viewers. I think that's just a remarkable testament to what's been built in women's basketball, and obviously continued to build for the national championship, the Final Four in the national championship viewership. So a lot taking place. Happy to respond to our basketball questions, but give you the opportunity to figure out what you ask. And I've been at this a while now. I'll figure out what questions I actually answer, I say with a sly smile.
All right. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a remote mic to you. Remember to identify yourself and the outlet you represent when you ask your question. Let's start right on the second row in the middle, and then we'll come to the far right standing.
Hi, Greg. Kevin Skarbinski with the SEC blog. What is the latest in terms of conversations on expanding the field in the men's basketball tournament?
We've had updates. I think the men's basketball committee and the women's basketball committees at the Division I level have handled the assignment responsibly. We were briefed as commissioners in the summertime about what I would call incremental growth. Whether that's possible or not remains to be seen. Charlie Baker provided an update. We were together 3 or 4 weeks ago about the continuing work. Obviously, we have a format this year. The NCAA has contracts that do go out a while, so I expect that discussion and work would continue. My general view is interested and supportive interest in that discussion. I am curious about the format that might be proposed if there is growth, how those teams are decided, how those teams are assigned, and we'll continue, I think, to ask questions and receive updates and appreciate, from my perspective, that both the men's and the women's committees are taking this growth effort seriously. And I would contextualize this. People will talk about, well, it should never change. I've seen plenty of that feedback, but you continue to see changes around Division I. From a conference membership, you have new members in new places. So I think that discussion is the right discussion given the time we're in.
Okay, question standing on the far right, and then we'll come down to the front row on the right.
Ryan Hennessy, NBC 13 in Birmingham. This offseason, seeing Coach Calipari move to another SEC school, and then there's talks about other coaches in the SEC taking that Kentucky job. Is this the healthiest you've seen basketball in the SEC, and how do you like to see a big-time coach stay in the conference like that?
Well, you know, the transfer portal's there for coaches too, right? So we've had that in different sports. I said yesterday, it's good to have John in the league. It's great to get to know Mark and come to know him. I saw Eric Musselman back in Vegas around the LSU-USC game, and I enjoyed working with Eric and the energy that he brought. From an evaluation of health, if you go back to 2004 and look back a little bit, we had remarkably competitive basketball at the highest level broadly in this league. And when I took over in 2015, really in preparation for the interviews, but then as you're trying to make decisions, looked at what happened in that 24 to 2014 or 15, 16 window. A lot of change, a lot of lack of continuity, if you will. So we had a cycle of coaching changes in some places. In fact, if you go back, I think Billy Donovan and Kevin Stallings at that time in 2014 were the longest tenured coaches, and had been kind of at that level of sustained success. John had come in, won a national championship. But you had a lot of churn. You also had the academic progress rate and the academic performance program, where I think we hadn't adjusted quickly to meeting the expectations in those programs. Programs adapted. Our APR scores improved. I think even over time in men's basketball, our graduation rates improved. So there's a lot there. I think it's been really healthy before, really competitive. Arkansas joined, won the national championship, Kentucky in '96 and '98, but others were close. The depth right now is not something we've seen in a long time. And I'm not sure even when we had those high level teams, you saw the depth. Now we've grown to 16. You know, we have 9 of the top 25 on the men's basketball side and 7 of the top 25 in the AP poll on the women's basketball side from one conference. And everybody wants to grab that mountaintop. So I do think it's an enormously positive story about the health of our basketball, both on the men's and women's side. I think it's an indication of meeting our own expectations, which when our men's performance lagged, I spoke about in rooms. And I hope we can exceed our expectations and, you know, not just attain the national championship opportunities we've seen on the women's side, but multiple teams playing for those championships.
Question on the front row on the right.
Alan Cole, GamecockScoop.com. You mentioned the football, possibly 8 or 9. Is there any discussions about basketball maybe going up from either the 16 women's games or the 18 men's games with 2 more schools coming into the league?
I did not mention 8 or 9, but you've asked me about it. You know, all I talked about was football scheduling that we talked about last week. So Yeah, there's been conversations about 16 to 18. We've taken a lot of input, sometimes probably incoming, from our women's coaches about increasing that number. They think they've benefited from the non-conference scheduling, from the buys, the open dates they have that have been filled with some prominent non-conference games. That conversation does continue, however. I think just this fall, being at 16, seeing different teams rolling through on a more regular basis than what we've experienced in the divisional format, the notion of doing that in other sports is very much on our mind.
Next question, the far left, way on the last row.
Greg, Josh Neighbors, 103.7 The Buzz. There's been kind of a conversation about court and field storming fines, 3 in the last week happening across the SEC, and how those kind of numbers have gone up. Conversation about NIL, things like that, going in-house has been going on too, which would be more money coming from athletic departments. Any thought about revisiting the tiers of the fines for court stormings and field stormings?
Well, let's talk about court stormings and field rushing first. It is not related to name, image, and likeness and what happens with the House settlement. That is a separate event, separate act. I can go back to videos outside of our league and stories, and you can Google these easily, of people putting themselves onto a field or on a court and being hurt by a falling goalpost, by an encounter with someone, by jumping over a wall and breaking a leg. That seems unwise. I get the emotion that builds up. So that's one element. The second element is you can see encounters with fans and players. It's an emotional moment. Those players, those coaches belong on the field. They are there to be on that field, to be on that court. Our fans are there to be in the stands. And so just 2 weeks ago, plenty of social media activity. Have you seen this? Well, the players are trying to exit. And this conflict that can happen concerns me. That's at the top of my concerns, not fines and whether that affects name, image, and likeness. The ability for teams, for cheerleaders, for medical staffs, for coaching staffs to move away safely and without disruption. That's on my mind. We have not, sure, I get phone calls. Why do we do this? It doesn't stop anything. I would actually represent there would be more court rushes and more field stormings if we did not have the system we have in place. We have adjusted. So now the visiting team is the recipient of the fine money, not our scholarship program. So when we had the events we've had this year, there's a transfer of $100,000 or $250,000 to the visiting team. That's a big deal. Our fans are writing checks by rushing the field to their opponents. I think that will become old, and it goes from $100,000 for a first offense under our new policy to $250,000, and if you're at $250,000, it then goes to $500,000. I don't think anybody wants to give their opponent free money. So that's how I view the issue. On the NIL issue, there's going to be budget strain. There are efforts on my part, efforts on our campus at how do you continue to grow the revenue, knowing that 22% of that in sponsorships, media, and ticket sales is going to be part of our economic relationship with our student athletes should the House settlement be approved. That does create strain, but I would just position that those are two very different issues. Maybe they link economically, but the first one is one that still has to be a serious consideration for us, and I think for our colleagues across the country.
Your next question, front row on the left, and then we'll go to the third row in the middle.
John, you looked like you were bored by that answer before you were.
Oh, all right.
You had your
Never
head
bored.
in your hand,
It's a long time to sit here.
Yeah.
In general. But I had two questions. One is, what do you tell your coaches about any potential impacts of not NIL but NLI getting away from the national letter of intent?
Yeah.
And also, how much do coaches kind of worry about mid-season transfers that can really impact a team that year?
So the first one, the question was about the change announced in the national letter of intent moving away. So I was concerned about it. I had to be educated, and I spent 10 years here where the SEC managed on behalf of the entire nation the national letter of intent program. It really is an administrative change where substantively I think it will be managed the same way. We're still going to have signing dates. There's still going to be documents to sign. There's going to be institutional aid agreements. There's specificity around only signing one of those. So there was a furor about what are they doing, and then as our staff has educated our campuses have educated their coaches, the ability to communicate, it's not nearly the significant change that it might seem. We're still going to go on with signing dates. The documents will be a bit different. The mid-year transfer issue, I can go back. There was an international player who was at the University of Florida back in the 2000s who in February said, I'm out. We've had young people walk away from teams for different reasons for decades. I'm mad at my coach. I'm not getting enough playing time. I want to go back home. That happens. We publicize it differently now. And in fact, you can argue in football, the 4-game red shirt rule creates another moment for this transfer behavior to occur. I don't have so much of it in basketball. A couple of years ago when the transfer portal was 365 days a year, I did have conversations at our basketball tournaments about young people getting on a bus telling a coach, I'm going to leave after this. I think that behavior's been reduced. So have there been conversations? Sure. Has the behavior taken place? It has. Is it only right now? No, it's gone on for a long time for different reasons. It's magnified now because of the frequency and the nature of the why. I have more conversations about the information that indicates the transfer portal activity happens once the window opens, really for a relatively short period of time. And you've seen an NCAA adjustment to go from 45 days down to 30. My view is that could be shortened. That's a declaration date window, or set of declaration dates within that window. It's not an ultimate decision date. And everybody involved needs to move on. And I would argue, from having talked to student athletes, the longer the window is open, the more pressure, the more they talk about the mental strain of people coming to them saying, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that. I'm one who thinks we need to open it, should be open for a reasonable amount of time. We should close that window, and everybody should move on and make their decisions.
Hey, question in the middle on third row.
Reed Darcy with The Advocate in Baton Rouge. Commissioner, I'm glad you mentioned a couple questions ago about the ways you're looking to grow revenue, because I wanted to ask you about the settlement looming on the horizon and revenue sharing appearing to be close to becoming coming to fruition. How do you see that major change maybe trickling down to some of the Olympic sports, maybe specifically basketball?
Well, just for purposes of my sake in answering so we don't misinterpret each other, Olympic sports is like a broad category. So if you dig into statements, there are 2, maybe 3 of our sports that generate net revenue. Football obviously leading, men's basketball, and some of our campuses baseball. Generally, other than that, there's a deficit between revenue and expenses. I'll let our campuses speak to their opportunities. Some of that's facility adjustments. You create new club spaces, you create new ways to use your facilities. You've seen different events that are conducted around our athletics departments. For us, we have limited space where we're allocated the revenue authority, if you will. So we run championships, we have broadcast rights, we have some other rights. We have the ability on a limited basis to involve corporate partners or corporate sponsors with us. Our campuses do that. We're not selling that for them like some of the professional leagues do to centralize. We don't centralize merchandise rights like a number of the professional leagues. We don't have centralized licensing in the same way. And our schools have wanted it that way. So they're going to focus on growing their revenue. We'll focus where we can on growing our revenue. Part of the reality is it's an enormous adjustment. It's an enormous adjustment. You know, you don't have a 22% increase in expenses and not have impacts. The clear themes, and we just left a couple days with our presidents and chancellors at the beginning of this week, is we want to continue to support broad-based programs. We want to be the center of the Olympic development effort, certainly in track and field and in swimming and diving, but I talked about Joni Taylor's involvement in our Olympic basketball effort. That happens over and over from our campuses early on as they go into the NBA. In fact, long-term implications on a number of other sports are real. So our motivation is to keep intact what we have, but there will be adjustments. And I expect that nationally. You don't have a shift of 22% of revenues and not have impacts associated with that shift.
Other questions? If you'll raise your hand, we'll get one of the mics to you. Raise your hand if you have other questions for the commissioner. Last call. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have our next